Today we'll be looking at Tattoo, one of the more, shall we say, controversial episodes about Voyager. Now, if you look at me and are saying, well, Arshankaya, what do you mean? Let me to elaborate. Most people, okay, I have actually, I've said before that I've heard someone defend just about anything within the realm of Star Trek, you know. And pretty much regardless of general accepted mediums of quality or anything whatsoever, there's usually someone out there somewhere who's going to say, you know, well, blah. To give you an idea of a popular one, Star Trek V, which I consider to be one of the worst examples of Star Trek ever, one of the defenses I've heard used legitimately, I might add, to defend it was that it was very ambitious. Okay, I can see that. But that kind of thing isn't what I'm talking about here. Most Star Trek that I'm going to cover throughout the course of Voyager that is just is ironically going to be easier to look at than this episode, or the type of episode this is. I talked about this as well before. There's a difference between bad and bad. And this is merely bad. I could just summarize my thoughts here very simply, but there's an important point I'll get to. I'll get to that in just a second. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it's easier to dissect, analyze, and consider the realities of something that is awful over something that is merely disinteresting, at least in my opinion. But the real point I'm trying to make, as I mentioned, is that I have heard some people say they absolutely love this episode. I've heard some people say that they really like this episode and they really like where it's going and they really like its tone and blah 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 blah. If I haven't made it obvious yet, that is not my opinion. And of course, I'm not trying to shove my opinion on you guys. I just wanted to kind of get this warning out here right off the bat. Basically, it's like this. If you're one of those people who likes this episode, there is nothing wrong with that, and I'm sure you could probably give me some actual reasons for it, other than just I like it. You know, that's fine. But I'm going to give you my reasons why I dislike it. But I wanted to mention this because it was difficult to analyze. This is probably the least notes, the second least notes I've had of virtually any episode I've done throughout Voyager. The least one being the one that has no notes at all. I actually can't remember what episode that was. I think that was a Elogium, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, maybe it was. No, it had to have been Elogium because it wasn't twisted. Whatever. Let's just talk about this episode, shall we? So, I'd also like to take it aside and say that this was the hardest one to do changes for, by far. But I'll get to that later. One of the episode starts off right off the bat with a talk about how they're low on resources and they need stuff, you know, they need blah 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 in order to reinitialize the warp core. Okay, I'm with that, and I get that. And the idea that they would be scanning planets and asteroids and just about everything on the trip in order to find stuff, in order to supplement their supplies, that makes perfect sense. Either stuff they could mine from anywhere that looks unclaimed, or stuff they could purchase or otherwise barter for. All that makes perfect sense. Then about 30 seconds later, that slightly interesting plotline, which admittedly is actually the driving force behind this episode from a technical perspective, is immediately abandoned because they find a small little campfire thing, and there was a, you know, there's a symbol on it, and Chakotay immediately goes into flashbacks. Whoosh, flashbacks. And by the way, get used to that. A fairly large portion of this episode is flashbacks. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then, you know, dun, 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 he's like, oh my gosh, this may be something related to something I knew when I was a boy. Dun, dun, dun. Cute teaser end. Now, I'm sorry, I'm making fun, but that's because I've seen the whole episode. From the perspective of someone who is seeing this for the first time, I have to admit that that's probably a fairly effective teaser. And the reason why is very simple. Twofold. One, right off the bat, boom, what are we doing here? We're low on resources. Done. Okay, makes sense. You know, it's fitting with the theme of the show as a series. I'm with it. Okay, what's the second thing we establish? The very second thing we establish is that something here is nearly identical to something back in the Alpha Quadrant. All the other details don't actually matter, if you follow me, because that's what catches most people's attention, myself included. Oh, this is something that you saw way back in the Alpha Quadrant. Whereas, you know, we're now in the Delta Quadrant. I mean, do I even have to elaborate on this for you? So, okay. Being fair, I will admit that's an effective teaser. Then we go more into the episode. I really have very few notes here. I do apologize, but I'm just going to start going down these one by one. First of all, when you're making up a fictional race or a fictional mythos, or mythos if you prefer, one of the things that I've always found it important to do is avoid silly-sounding names if you can. Obviously, in some cases you cannot, for reasons I don't feel like going into, but I can think of a couple out of the top of my head. But if you can avoid silly-sounding reasons, please do try to do so. Why? Because when you start hearing about the mythic ancients of the rubber people and their quest to find the sky spirits, any human being who hears that is going to have... Well, I'm sorry, I am generalizing. Most people who hear that is going to have an automatic... let's call it a predisposition to not take it seriously or with any level of merit. Because it sounds silly. Now, silly things that sound silly or things that are silly can be made to be serious, can actually be serious. This is true in real life as well. But when you're in fiction, you have the power to say, well, let's call it something a little bit... You know, at the very least, you can make up a word. The Titorians are the people I've been searching for, and for the ancient ones who they referred to as those from the sky. There we go. Boom. Just did it, just like that. As opposed to the rubber people? Now... You know what, let's just... Here's the problem, okay? I've already talked about the problems with Chakotay in this show. I have. And I've already... just to rehash very briefly, the biggest problem with Chakotay in this show is not only that he has no character arc, because a lot of characters have that problem, but on top of that, most of the episodes that are Chakotay episodes, we don't actually learn anything about him. We learn things about his past or his history, but it has no relevance to him, right? This episode does actually have an exception to that right at the end. I'll get to that. That's literally right at the end. It's in the coda. But most of this episode is not about Chakotay. He just happens to be the character who gets the screen time most of the time. This episode is all about his flashbacks, his people, his back here story, but we don't actually learn anything about him. That's my first problem with it. Second problem is... well, the obvious one, and I talked about this before too, so to again reiterate in brief, if you're going to try to make something sound American Indian-y, and you go to research something, you go to ask someone to write up, a whole treatise, a whole Bible as they called it for this, you might want to do at least a little bit of double checking rather than getting someone who is a well-known fraud and someone who is not any level, type, or form of an American Indian, and literally was just making up stuff off the top of his head, because when you're approaching this as though you're trying to treat it with respect, and then you start babbling about these things that are just terrible, I'm just going to summarize that, are just terrible, you're going to come across as though you're being condescending, or disrespectful, or both. And that's one of the reasons why this episode really bothers me so much. If you'll forgive me for going on a bit of a segue. I apologize. I know I just did this in the last episode with regards to writing, but this is about writing as well. But this is about the topic of religion, okay? Now, anybody who's watched anything of mine whatsoever knows that I try to avoid that topic for reasons I've already gone into. I don't like going into charged topics because, in my experience, most people can't actually have a reasonable discussion about them. If you'll forgive me for putting up a contrast here, Babylon 5's JMS is an atheist, okay? Or was an atheist at the time. I don't know if he still is, obviously. The reason that's relevant is because despite being an atheist, religion and the discussion of multiple religions, actually, was something that was done in the show, and in my opinion, done correctly. And the reason why is incredibly simple and very easy to explain. He approached it with an air of respect. Just because I don't agree with you, just because I don't believe in what you believe, does not mean that I get to make fun of you for that. Or I should say, it doesn't mean I get to ridicule you. There's a difference between making fun and ridiculing. There's a difference between, poking fun at someone and scorning them, or looking down upon them, or treating them as though they're ridiculous or foolish or stupid, right? It's kind of funny because Babylon 5 was all about tolerance in character, but also in a degree out of character as well in a meta sense, because of the way he approached so many topics, including this one. In my opinion, no, that's not to say he was 100% successful. I'm just showing that as an example of a show that I think did do that general concept fairly well. Star Trek in general does not. Now, I have to say in general because we're talking about all of Star Trek as a whole. Probably the one time religion was handled moderately well was over on Deep Space Nine. And I shouldn't say the one time, it's more like the several times. There are a couple of exceptions to this, of course. A good example would be the episode Who Watches the Watchers? And I know some people are going to bring up problems with that, but well, let's not even go into it. Let's not even do it. My point is, Star Trek has, on occasion, as the exception, treated this topic properly, but most of the time it hasn't. And this is another example of that, because the overall idea here is that Star Trek tends to treat religion like a do-anything button, to put it into such terms. For example, this episode, let's just pull it out here. Let's look at some of the things that the rubber people do in this episode. Or, I'm sorry, the Sky Spirits do in this episode. Number one, they manage to magically know where the Voyager is trying to beam down and generate just the right type of disturbance on that spot to prevent them from beaming down, but at the same time do absolutely nothing to try to prevent them from beaming up. Now you may say, well, of course, they want them to leave, not come back, but to which I respond, you're kind of missing the point. Try to think about the level of advanced either technology or magic or whatever it would take to do that. Just genuinely think about this for a moment. Let's do a second example. Look at the storm that buffets the shuttle, and indeed the Voyager. In fact, at one point, Kim, and I quote, says it's at basically a monsoon out there. Now, I have never seen a monsoon in person, but I have seen quite a bit about monsoons, and I know people who have. Monsoons are serious things, and that kind of thing only happens with, well, I'm not going to go into the full science of it, but let's just say that there's a lot of energy that is utilized and generated, or I'm sorry, not generated, but poured through, I think is the way I want to put that, in order to make a monsoon happen. That is a massive force, right? And then there's the fact that they managed to perfectly cloak everything that they wish to within reason, including the shuttle, for example, their ship in general. I'm sorry, not their ship, their people, their civilization, Chakotay at one point in time, just whoosh. And ironically, of all the things on this list, that's actually the one that sounds the most reasonable to me personally. But the point I'm trying to get across here is not that any of these things are unreasonable. I was just talking about this in the last episode. It feels like lazy writing because rather than thinking about it, rather than going back and actually trying to outline the whys and the hows and explain any of this, they treat it like it's just magic. You don't have to explain it. It's just magic. Just like they did with Q Light in the previous episode. It's just there, and he just does stuff, and it doesn't matter how or why. It doesn't matter how or why these Sky Spirit people do all these things. None of this matters. Don't think about it. And that last part I just said right there is ultimately the core reason why this type of lazy writing bothers me, because it could be argued that there's nothing necessarily wrong with lazy writing as long as it's enjoyable. I don't like this type of lazy writing because of that last sentence. Don't think about it. That is just me. That is just the way I am. But if I am being encouraged via the story to not think about it, then my enjoyment of it is going to go down considerably. I almost hate myself for confessing this, but when I was watching this episode for this video just like an hour ago, obviously because it's a 40-minute episode, I had to pause it on several occasions because I just could not bring myself to continue watching it. It was so disinteresting. And on several occasions, I actually had my music playing while the episode was going. I mean, I could still hear the episode, but the point was, at least there was something that was engaging my brain. Oh, and I feel sad for admitting this because, I knew what I was getting into. This is season 2 Voyager. It's all downhill from here. It's going to get better from this point on. But God, so many of these episodes are just, I almost threw in the towel. I was almost just like, screw it. Here's Tattoo. It sucks. All right, there's your video. But as usual, I don't like doing that. I want to explain. So let's see. What other notes do I have here? What other notes do we have? Okay, so I do actually have a couple other genuine notes about this episode, but it probably wouldn't surprise you that none of them have, well, none of them, virtually none of them have anything to do with Chakotay. But let's finish up Chakotay's arc. I've only got 2 more notes on him here. So, the problem with the flashbacks is, well, okay, I already listed the big problem. We don't actually learn anything about Chakotay until the very end, and so the flashbacks don't actually have any purpose other than filling up time. Because, and you forgive me for putting this here, but if I were to change this episode, one of the things I would do is basically eradicate the flashbacks, other than the first one. The first one I think was good, and I mean this sincerely. It probably could have been shorter. It could have literally just been him, you know, a little explanation about him, his father. And by the way, no disrespect to the gentleman who plays Chakotay's father. I actually think he's a pretty good actor, all things considered. Not great, but, you know, he does a good job. And we see him a couple other times throughout Voyager, so, you know, nothing against him. But have him there, have young Chakotay there, have them discover the thing, have him explain what it is, have him kind of nod, and that's it. You don't actually need anything else whatsoever of the flashbacks. None of it has anything to do with anything of any relevance or import, because that first one gets across the 2 points that are really important. Number 1, Chakotay cares about his father. Number 2, I already mentioned this. A symbol, you know, a thing that was done in the Alpha Quadrant is done here as well. Boom! That's it. That's all you need. So you have that. I mean, you could do more with this, but just bear with me. Having that first flashback keeps the attention on the focus of those 2 points. Would allow you to have, instead of just doing flashbacks, you know, why not have Chakotay slowly elaborate and explain his story over the course of the episode, either to the log or to the crew members or to the aliens. There's all sorts of options here. You could even do a mixture of the above in order to have him slowly reveal himself, more of himself to us. Rather than show him as this brat kid, which I'll talk about in just a moment, why not have it... Why not show us why it is, or why not have him explain to us, you know, what he was feeling at the time, how he was going through the time. Have him show us who he is now by how he views what he was then. You know? It's just right off the top of my head there. Okay, so the other problem I just mentioned, I just want to talk about it. I know that younger actors, especially in Star Trek because of budget problems, tend to be bad. And I know that working with younger actors and child actors is always going to be a problem. I've mentioned this problem before. But I just got to say, the kid who plays young Chakotay, I don't know how old he actually is, I don't care. He does an absolutely abysmal job. He's terrible. He's awful. I know sometimes you can't do anything else about it, and I know that, you know, that necessarily can't be blamed on the episode, but I do have to mention that, to be a little bit blunt, a lot of my personal enjoyment of the episode went down because of that guy. Because he was just... Huh? Anyways. Let's talk about the last thing about Chakotay here real quick here. So, right at the end, I mentioned this before, he is talking with Mr. Sky Spirit, and who, by the way, I'm sorry, just to tack on a couple other things these guys can do with magic. He holds his hand for a moment, and then manages to communicate with him perfectly and flawlessly. He also, with no sign of communicating with anyone whatsoever, manages to stop the storm and save Voyager, basically just like that. Bunch of other stuff like that. Let's just skim over that. But I just wanted to get across the point that there are more examples of these guys. Now, I also know that some people are probably going to defend this, because I've heard this before, by saying that these gentlemen are a living embodiment of Clark's Law, right? You know, that they are just so advanced that whatever they're doing is obviously not magic, it's just extremely advanced technology. And I could get behind that idea to an extent. But the problem is when that is being used as a defense or an excuse, in my opinion, you've already lost the battle, if you know what I mean. If you approach the situation saying, okay, we got to explain how these people are so super powerful and everything, let's at least think about it, as opposed to, oh, they could just do it, don't think about it. Clark's Law, you know, they're just super advanced, they're so much more advanced than us, that's all. You get my point. I'm sorry, I'll shut up about it. At the end, he's talking to Sky Spirit Guy. And he gives, it's one of Robert Peltran's better scenes in my opinion, not just in this episode, but in the first 2 seasons in general, because he really gets across the impact of what happened to him. and this is part of why I say he could have just told us his story rather than us seeing it through flashbacks. He actually shows, and I know I talk a lot about show and don't tell, but just bear with me. I'll explain. The reason I say that in this case is not true is because, given the limitations of the show in this case, which is to say basically all you can do is flashbacks, there's only so much you can show with that, especially given the fact that we have to have a young Chakotay, as I just mentioned. And a younger actor is not going to have as good of a whole handle on displaying everything that's going on with him at the time. On the second hand, we have Robert Beltran, who, while not a phenomenal actor, is a good actor, and as is demonstrated in this episode, actually has the capacity to get across the proper emotional gravitas and impact of the given situation. So, in my opinion, given the limitations of what they were dealing with, it would have been better if Beltran had just portrayed, anyways, moving on. He's talking with the guy. I know I keep getting to this point. He's talking to the guy, and he explains, how he and his father never really mended their wounds from that particular point in time. They weren't exactly at odds with each other, but he never really reconciled himself with them. And he mentions how his father had, decided to raise up arms and fight for what he believed in, the Maquis, right? He doesn't actually say it's the Maquis, but he doesn't have to, because, duh, I shouldn't even have to explain this. And then he mentions how it was then his decision, based on that, to go ahead and take up arms with him. And I love the way it expresses so much about Chakotay so simply, so eloquently, because from that we learn that he is someone who obviously had a deal of respect for his father, and indeed still has a great deal of respect for his father, and actually regrets the fact that he was never able to reconcile with his father. And he mentions flat out, why is this tattoo... Yes, that's right. The tattoo actually finally comes in. The thing that the episode is named for right there at the end is because he wears it to honor his father. Now, he adds a line about... It derails after that, but I'll just get to that derailment in a second. He talks about the tattoo, and he talks about why he took up all of this cause, why it is he still works the way he works, why it is he feels... We learn more about Chakotay in this scene. And it's actually talking about his past as relevant to his character, rather than just, here's my past. Now, I mentioned derailment. That's because this scene immediately nosedives, because it all becomes about, a people and our land and our policies. And literally, you can tell the moment. It's in the middle of a sentence when it stops being about him and his relationship with his father and his character and his growth and what he thinks and what he feels, and immediately goes back into just being about, his made-up American Indians. And the rest of this Dakota is just, huh? And they just had to throw in this thing. They had to throw in a scene with Tuvok approaching, and Kess, I believe. I don't even remember who the third person was. It doesn't matter. And they're obviously concerned. And these people are obviously here for him, worried about him. And they see him with an alien that they do not recognize, and they approach with weapons ready because they have a brain. And Chakotay says, in the most disrespectful tone I could come up with off the top of my head, I cannot do it, forgive me, put those away. Just he doesn't say lower your weapons, or these are not a threat, or don't worry, we're friends here. He says, he just has to condescend as he says it, put those away. Just, oh my God. Ow, that actually hurt. Let's talk about the other half of this episode, because that's right, there's a B plot. I've talked before about why I think there doesn't need to be an A plot or a B plot. Hang on just a second. Sorry about that. The B plot has to do with the Doctor, and contrary to what you might think, it's not actually about his character growth, his character arc, or anything interesting about him whatsoever. It's an attempt to use the Doctor as a form of bad comedy. Ironically, I also just finished talking about this last episode, too. The Doctor acts... Okay, in the beginning, the very first scene where he's talking with Ensign Wildman, I believe. Naomi Wild. No, Naomi's the daughter. Ensign Wildman is the mother. This is the woman who became pregnant earlier in Elogium. He is telling her exactly what's wrong with her, why she's experiencing pain, and gives her ways in which she can reasonably not be in pain in the future. And he says, if it gets worse, we'll try to do something more medically related to relieve the pain, but I don't feel like there's anything absolutely necessary to do right now. Okay? Now, while that could be seen as a bit of a cold fish, in my opinion, that's very in character for the Doctor. And I liked that first scene and the last scene, but we'll get into that in a minute. Because that first scene was all about the Doctor expressing a bit of who he is as a character. Forgive me for the obvious, but he is a doctor. While he lacks a degree of sympathy or empathy, he is not cold-hearted. He is not being a cold fish. He is not trying to be mean. In fact, the way he presents it is very professional. I have no problem ensuring that you are better, but I'm not going to go overboard when I feel like there are simpler and more natural routes to accomplish this. And there's a degree of the performance that Robert managed to pull out there, where he actually portrays himself as someone who does care about his patients. And this is something that the Doctor has shown throughout his arc, even up to this point, and will continue throughout the thing. You know, the fact that he genuinely cares about his patients. I'm with that, because he's a doctor. Then it immediately goes into the other aspect of the plot, and rather than being someone who cares about his patients, he goes from being, you know, someone who is sympathetic or empathetic to, it's actually in the next scene we see with him, to someone who is a pretentious, I don't have a good word for it, that isn't vile, but let's just say that someone I would probably punch right in the face if I saw them in person. Seriously, legitimately, just bam, right there. Because he is a complete dick throughout the majority of the rest of the episode. And the thing is, and this is so stupid. This is the biggest thing I would change, or at least I could say I would change, because it's so much easier to explain why. He mentions that, you know, he is going to go ahead and take Kes up on her challenge and experience illness. And for just a fleeting moment, we think that maybe he's doing so for good reasons, to understand what it is he's missing, to understand why it is that, you know, the crew act the way they do when they're sick. And no, he immediately shoots that down and says, no, I'm going to prove that the crew is a bunch of whiny crybabies, and they all just need to go back to their job and get their work done. And for example, Ensign Kim walks in and says, Doc, I don't feel well, and the doctor's response is immediately to say, neither do I, but you don't see me complaining about it. This is again trying to make humor out of something that is not particularly funny to me. I'm sure some people enjoy the humor aspect of this episode, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I've already basically explained why I don't find it funny. It's that particular form of schadenfreude, again, and not my thing. But on top of that, the whole thing takes this really weird twist right at the end, where the Doctor starts freaking out because he's still sick and he shouldn't be. And in almost cartoon fashion, the contrast between his arrogant, uppity, punch-in-the-face-itude from before is immediately contrasted by being the biggest whiny crybaby in the known universe at the latter half. And I have to give the actor props for pulling off these two extremes as well as he does, but the only reason it was done from a writing perspective is so that you would actually feel good about the latter, because you believe he deserves it thanks to the former. They showed him being so horrible so you actually enjoy the fact that he is now suffering in the latter. It's a fairly common thing. And I don't feel like getting into that topic. It has to do with comeuppance, basically, and a degree of viewer enjoyment based off of perceived justice in result to injustice, and I don't feel like going into it, like I said. But suffice it to say, there is no character growth for the Doctor whatsoever. Any possible message or point it might have had immediately flounders. And while Ricardo, one of these days I'll get his name right, does do an excellent job, as he usually does, there's just no enjoyment to be had from it for me. So, I guess we'll move on, because that's all I got, really. Did I enjoy this episode then? No. Do I enjoy this episode now? I think I've made my point clear on that one. Even talking about this episode, I've been playing WoW in the background a little bit here, just because. So, what would I change? Now, I actually spent. I guess I kind of lied, because I finished watching this episode about an hour and a half ago. I have spent literally the hour and a half since then, while doing other things, thinking about what I would change to this episode. Allow me to give you guys a bit of a tidbit. Tattoo was one of the first episodes that I really was going to completely change from the original intent. I know I kind of did that already. The 37s is a good example, and so is Twisted and Elogium. All of these are good examples of episodes that I basically just took what I felt to be the theme, and then that's it. Everything else about the episode was thrown out the window. But Tattoo is a no-really example of this. Tattoo was actually going to be the second story in the arc about the Baori, if you remember them, the guys I mentioned back in the 37s. Tattoo was going to be the episode when the Voyager crew finally caught up with the planet where they had been given, you know, the location of the Baori, and there would be certain revelations about the circumstance, and they would figure out, you know, why the Baori were here, and you know what had happened to them, and they would learn about how they had been hunted by this ancient race they encountered, blah 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 blah. You know. All sorts of plot developing stuff, and this wouldn't be the end of the thing. This would not be the end of the Baori storyline by any stretch of the imagination. But obviously I'm not going to be doing that now. I just thought I'd mention it because I know several people asked specifically about the Baori storyline and were wondering, you know, well, what gives? And there were plenty of questions left unanswered in that, and indeed on purpose. But changing the episode just with the page one rewrite, that was challenging. That was incredibly challenging. I honestly, and I hate myself for saying this, but without fundamentally changing the point of the episode, I don't think this episode can be salvaged. All I could do is minor changes to make it more tolerable. For example, why don't we do some actual research on Native Americans and Native Indians or Native Americans and American Indians. I can talk, I swear. And why don't we actually have some reasoned, well thought out thoughts and see, the point is, the overall point is to just make it more polished. Try to add a little bit of actual work into this, rather than just kind of throwing together whatever you've got based on the information you have, which is obviously a fallacy, and treat it with just a modicum of respect. And I've already talked about the other things I would change. Make it more about Chakotay. Make him actually be the one who expresses this whole thing to us. Make, you know, fix the Doctor plot so it actually is about his character growth, and we actually do have him learning a little bit about empathy and sympathy during the course of this thing. You know, blah, 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 blah. All of these things sound so obvious, though, as weird as it sounds. I feel like I'm cheaping out because I don't know what else there is that you could change about this episode, and still retaining, you know, the page one rewrite. So I guess this is the closest I'm ever coming to throwing in the towel on the changes section, right here. At least so far, because we've still got Threshold coming up, and I'm going to have to figure that one out, too. Threshold was also going to be part of the Baori storyline, by the way. And it was going to be a catalyst for the entire third season, actually. But anyways, let's just move on. I guess that's it. Kind of a short thing, but whatever. Next episode is going to be a slightly better one. We're going to be looking at Cold Fire, and then Maneuvers, which I actually rather liked, and then Resistance, which I don't, and then Prototype, which we're not going to talk about, and then Alliances, which is an episode I almost always skip when I rewatch Voyager. And then Threshold. I will talk to you guys later.